Just hang this. Who else gets you one piece?
Shabbat Shalom. So we're going to do a study session on the book of Psalms. And maybe I'll just let people who want to leave, and settle down, get a glass of water or something, refresh yourself. So we'll wait about 30 seconds here to let it settle down. This session is the first of what we hope will be a series. So this will be a 5-part series in all, 4 more sessions. The other ones will come in future weeks and months, the exact dates to be determined. I'm hoping that this session will last about 50 minutes, 50. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Can people see that? Can you nod or let me know? Can everyone see that? Or yes, okay, thank you. Okay. Maybe you, whoever's controlling this, Marianne, I think, you could allow everyone to unmute if they want to. I'd ask you not to unmute at this point, but I want this to allow questions if people want to ask questions. And I don't think I can manage it by saying you, and pick people. So just respect etiquette. And if you have a question, chime in. So there's going to be an introduction, and then we can have questions at the end of the introduction. Then I'm going to go over 4 Psalms today. And again, maybe hold the questions to the end of my presentation of each Psalm. Okay, so the book of Psalms. First of all, what is it? It's a collection of 150 Psalms, or 151 in the Eastern churches, like the Orthodox churches. And the numbering differs between the Catholic and the Eastern churches version and the Jewish Protestant version. The Protestants readopted the Jewish version when they split from Catholicism. So some of the Psalms, like 9 and 10, in the Eastern Catholic Church, are split, probably incorrectly, in the Hebrew version. So actually scholars think that what the Hebrew version has as 2 Psalms, 9 and 10, really should be 1 Psalm. And some are the other way around. So 147 in the Hebrew version and our version is 2 in the Catholic and Eastern division of Psalms. So when people talk about a certain Psalm, the numbering scheme, you have to know if you're using the Hebrew/Protestant numbering scheme or the Catholic or the Eastern Church's numbering scheme. The Psalms are almost, some Psalms are actually duplicated, almost word for word, or large passages are duplicated in the Psalms, and we'll talk about why that might be a little bit later. The Psalms are divided into 5 books, so to speak. Again, this is like the scholars saying this. Each book ends with a benediction. So that's sort of the clue. This is the end of what used to be a separate book. So for instance, Psalm 41 ends, "Blessed be the Lord of Israel for everlasting to everlasting, amen and amen," which is sort of outside the actual text of the Psalm. It's just sort of a little coda. And Psalm 72, which is the end of the second book, is more obvious, sorry. Now I gotta go up there. Ends with, "Blessed be the Lord God, the God of Israel, who only doth wondrous things, and blessed be his glorious name forever, and let the whole earth be filled with his glory, amen and amen. The prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended." Well, clearly they're not ended in the way the book is composed now, but once upon a time, this was a separate book. And there are 2 theories about this division. One is that there were originally 5 different collections of songs, and they were later united into 1 book. And the second theory is that the 3 divisions were added later to mimic the 5-fold division of the Torah. But it's noteworthy that the duplications that I talked about above never occur within the same book, which sort of leaves credit to the originally separate books. And some of the Psalms are simply repeated in the 2 books. And then when they united them, they didn't edit out the duplications, they left them in. In addition, the numbering of the actual verses sometimes is not consistent between different versions because of what's called the superscript. So a lot of the psalms start with a superscript like a song of David or to the choir master. And some of these things are, sometimes they are considered a separate verse and sometimes they're included in the first verse, and there's no consistency between the different traditions. So who wrote the Psalms? Well, according to Jewish tradition, the book of Psalms was composed by the following people: Adam, Melchizedek, Abraham, Moses, Heman, Yeduthun, who are two sort of minor characters in the book of Kings, Asaph, and the three sons of Korach. But according to Jewish tradition, the majority were authored by David, over half. And that, anyways, that would put the time period at about 1000 BC or earlier, since all the other characters are before David in the Bible. But according to biblical scholars, they were composed by a series of authors, most probably Levites, in the late First Temple period, in the Babylonian exile, and in the early Second Temple period. So the period is roughly 700 to maybe 800 to 400 BC, though some of the texts might be older than that and were incorporated. And they were collected into a whole sometime between 400 and 200 BC. Why do we know 200 BC, the latest date? Because the Psalms, pretty much as they appear here, appear in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, which is around 200 BC. So we have another collection. They must have been fixed in Hebrew by that date. It's also interesting to note that some passages appear in other biblical books, like Jeremiah and some of the other prophets, but it's impossible to say for certain if the authors of those books were quoting from already well-known poems, or if the later author of Psalms borrowed from Jeremiah and others. So their purpose and usage. The Hebrew book for Psalms is Tehillim, which means praises, which describes the theme of some, but not all of the Psalms. The word Psalms, on the other hand, comes from the Greek, and it means lyrics sung with a harp. And it first appears in the Septuagint. So the name of the book in the Septuagint, the Greek translation, is Psalms. And that indicates that, at least in the Second Temple period, when the Septuagint was translated and written, these were indeed songs sung with musical accompaniment in the temple, almost probably in the temple. So some of the Psalms include specific instructions or allusions to when and how they were to be sung. So for instance, the verse, bind the festival procession with branches and bring it to the horns of the altar, which appears in Psalm 118, suggests that this song is sung during the festival sacrifices. Or let my prayer be counted as incense, suggests that the song was sung during the offering of the incense. And others may be sung on certain days of the week. Mizmor Yom is still today sing a specific psalm for each day of the week, and many people believe that dates back to temple times, the Second Temple times at least. And some of them just may have been available for the music master or choir leader whenever he felt so moved. And many of the psalms begin with the instruction to the music master or choir master, Lamnetseach Mizmor. Lamnetseach is the choir master or the conductor or something like that. What is clear today is that the Psalms form a major part of the liturgy, not just in the Jewish services, but in the Christian one as well. In Jewish services, they comprise the primary text of Sukkot de Zimra, said on weekdays, Shabbatot, and on festivals, as well as the primary text of Hallel, which we recite on festivals and on new moons. It is also customary, especially in Orthodox circles, to recite Psalms while watching over a dead body prior to burial, or when praying for the recovery of a sick friend or a loved one. Or basically, whenever you want to curry God's favor, you recite Psalms. And there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of musical treatments of Psalms in Jewish liturgy, in church hymns and chants, in classical music, including symphonies, operas, cantatas, etc. And the Psalms are often set to music in the Rastafarian religion, and the most famous being Bob Marley's version of Psalm 137 by the Rivers of Babylon, which I'm sure everybody knows. So thematic types, what's the thematic material of the Psalms? Well, roughly speaking, they can be divided into the following themes. Hymns, which are simply song of praise. God is wonderful, his creation is wonderful. Communal laments, typically, though not always admitting to sin. We don't always admit to sin, but we certainly acknowledge the punishment, asking for forgiveness, redemption, deliverance, and or sometimes revenge. Individual laments, the same as the communal ones, but couched, I should say, in individual language. Royal psalms, dealing with such matters as kings, coronations, marriages, and battles. Thanksgiving psalms, thanking God for deliverance from personal distress. Wisdom psalms, simply giving good advice on how to live in God's good graces, and some miscellaneous other ones. It's important to note there is no consistent modern theology in the book of Psalms, other than perhaps God is very powerful and very personal. But no matter if you believe in that type of God or a more philosophical, remote God or no God at all, the Psalms can still speak to us, I believe, as they primarily address human emotions and the human need to express our gratitude, awe, despair, elation, fears, hopes, reliefs, and joys against the backdrop of something outside of ourselves. And that's how I view it. They're very powerful emotional poems. A little bit about the poetic structure. The Psalms make use of four common structures of biblical poetry. One is obviously meter, which often gets lost in the English translation, but they're very rhythmic. Parallel couplets, where the second half of the verse repeats or usually repeats the idea of the first half, or less often says something in contrast to it. But the second half of the verse is somehow parallel to the first half of the verse, often just repeating the first half in different words. Another form, considered a later form, is triplets, where three phrases repeat a theme, or in somehow strengthening it, each time getting a little bit stronger. Another structure is what's called a chiastic structure, where a verse or a few verses, or sometimes an entire chapter, or even a whole book, or a set of books is arranged so that the central idea is expressed in the middle. We would think it nowadays it would be at the end, but in those days they expressed in the middle of the text, with the early part building up to the central idea and the latter part sort of winding down. Thus, for instance, in the Torah, the tradition has it that Leviticus, the third of the five books, is the most important book. That's where all the sacrifices are and the most of the laws. Where sometimes the structure of a verse is simply A, B, B, A, thematically, not rhyming. Or in more elaborate chiastic structure, there's an explicit A, B, C, B, A, or A, B, C, D, C, B, A structure. Sometimes that's in a verse, sometimes it's in chapters of a book. This is a common thing in biblical literature. And I'm going to be using the Alter translation of the Psalms because he at least attempts to preserve the poetic structure of the Hebrew, although not always successfully. So let's start with Psalm 1, which seems like a good place to start. Oh, first of all, any questions about the introduction? So if you have a question, you can chime in. Okay, if not, we'll start with Psalm 1. Happy is the man who has not walked in wicked counsels, nor in the way of offenders has stood, nor in the session of scoffers has sat. But the Lord's teaching is his desire, and his teaching he murmurs night and day. And he shall be like a tree planted by streams of water, that bears its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and in all that he does he prospers. Not so the wicked, but like chaff the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand up in judgment, nor offenders in the band of the righteous. For the Lord embraces the way of the righteous, and the way of the wicked is lost. So this is the first psalm, and it's sort of an appropriate first psalm. It's in the, sorry, excuse me. It's sort of in the tradition of wisdom literature. In other words, teaching us how to live, like the book of Proverbs or Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, sort of reflecting on life and how one should live their life. It's important to note that it's very universal. It's not tied to anything historic. or any event. And that's very different than some of the other psalms that we'll see, which are very concrete and tied to certain events or certain historic periods or certain individuals. So it stands as a good introduction, and it sort of, makes an important point that Psalms repeats over and over again, which is that the righteous will be rewarded and the wicked will be punished. A little bit about the structure. So it opens up with a triplet. Happy the man who has not walked in wicked's counsels, nor in the way that the offenders has stood, nor in the session of scoffers has sat. And in a way, each part of this triplet strengthens the preceding one, which is, again, typical of biblical poetry. It starts off, you walk with people, with bad people. You're only with them for a short time. Then you stand with bad people. Takes a longer time to sort of stand around with them. And finally, you sit down with them and have, now you're spending a really long time with them. You're hanging around with them all day. So it sort of increases in strength. The second verse is a couplet, but the Lord's teaching is his desire. His teaching he murmurs night and day. And you could say the two halves of the verse basically repeat the same thought. So again, when we have couplets, typically the second half simply repeats the first half in different words. That's very common. Common poetic device. What else do we have here? Well, we have a few very, the image of like a tree planted by the stream of water. That's, become a famous image. The song, of course, that's like that. But again, it's very poetic. In a dry climate, trees don't thrive unless they're close to a water source, most trees. And as a result of being close to water, it bears fruit and its leaves don't wither. So this is the image of the righteous. Again, in the famous psalm, whose number escapes me right now, the psalm for Shabbat, we have the same image. The righteous shall flourish like the trees. They shall not wither in old age, or things like that. So the idea of not withering. Not so the wicked. The wicked, on the other hand, are like chaff. Chaff is dry. Chaff is all dried out. So it's not moist. It's not by the water. The wicked will not stand up in judgment, nor the offenders in the band of the righteous. Again, basically repeating a couplet that repeats the first thought. For the Lord embraces the ways of the righteous, and the way of the wicked is lost. Okay. So any comments or questions about this psalm? Okay. I just want to point out one more thing. The word murmur here is yehegeh, if you can see what my thing is, Torato yehegeh. And we have a famous prayer, Udvarecha yehegeh yomam v'layla. I think it's in the Ma'ariv prayer before the Ahava Rabbah. So it refers back to this. We will, it means murmur, but it means really to read under your breath. You're constantly repeating them under your breath. In those days, people did not read silently. There was no tradition of silent reading. You read out loud, but you sort of read quietly when no one else was around. So that phrase, yehageh, which is sort of an uncommon word, has made it into the prayer service, again, referring to the idea that we will constantly murmur God's teachings, and therefore we will get this reward. Okay, let's go to another psalm, Psalm 3. Just gonna rearrange my screen a bit here. Control this a little better. Okay, Psalm 3. So as opposed to the preceding psalm, which was very universal, this one is very concrete. It has a very particular time in history and a very particular person. A David psalm, when he fled from Absalom, his son. Lord, how many are my foes? Many who rise up against me. Many who say of my life, no rescue for him through God, Selah. And you, Lord, a shield are for me, my glory, who lifts up my head. With my voice I cry out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain, Selah. I lie down and I sleep. I awake, for the Lord has sustained me. I fear not from myriads of troops that round about set against me. Rise, Lord, rescue me, my God, for you strike all my foes on the cheek. The teeth of the wicked you smash. Rescue is the Lord's. On your people, your blessing. Selah. So, of course, the first thing to notice is this is extremely concrete. You have to know your Bible. Bible story in the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel, I believe. King David's son Absalom rebels against him, tries to take the throne. And at the beginning of the war, Absalom is winning and David has to run away and it looks like he might get killed. And so that's where the setting of this poem is, a very particular tale in the Bible. The subscription of David's psalm, tradition would say, well, David wrote it and it's written sort of in his voice. Scholars say, well, maybe not, probably not. It's a song about David. So when it says the David psalm, most scholars say, well, it probably wasn't written by him, it was written about him, which again, about half the psalms are. But be it as it may, how many are my foes? Many who rise up against me. Again, from a structure, it's a couplet. But this is another theme we see in many of the psalms: persecution. You could almost say paranoia. David is a very paranoid character. If you read the, maybe justified, but repeated theme is, I am being persecuted. My foes almost have captured me. They've almost killed me, and God has saved me, or God will save me. This is a repeated theme over and over again. And it's a very powerful theme. I mean, from an emotional point of view, maybe we haven't all been at the verge of death, but we've all felt sometimes in our life that our enemies are against us. Everything is too much. I'm about to collapse. God, save me. And that theme of God saving us from hardship, if not persecution, is what makes these psalms so powerful. And it's representative of a whole family of psalms that have this kind of tone to them. Again, why should God save me? As Ronnie said in the Torah, just because God loves us or loves David. There's no appeal here that I'm a good guy, I don't deserve it, none of that. It's just, save me, you love me. I'm pleading with you to save me for your name, not for my sake. A note on the word Selah, which appears 3 times in this poem. Nobody knows what Selah means. It is thought to be an instruction to the music master. It's a musical note of some sort, and it's assumed that it means that you should say it louder or emphasize it, because thematically these are things that would be emphasized, and it usually appears in a poem when you highlighting the main point, so to speak. So this means louder or crescendo or something like that, but that's a supposition. No one really knows. Again, a common theme, I lie down and I sleep. Well, who lies down and sleeps when they're being chased? Well, I do that because I have confidence in God, that God will sustain me. And I awake, and indeed the Lord has sustained me. And I fear not the myriad of troops that are round about me. Why don't I fear them? Because God is on my side. And then sort of asking God, but with a lot of confidence that he'll do it. Rescue me, my God, for you strike all my foes in the cheek. The teeth of the wicked you smash. Again, it's not even saying you have done it, you do this. It's just something I expect of you. I know you'll do it. And it's very violent, and it's very almost revengeful, smash their teeth. And finally, an interesting move, which again is typical of these style of poems. Although they're written about David personally, it somehow morphs in the last sentence to, your rescue is the Lord's, on your people, your blessing. Like somehow it morphs from David to the entire Jewish people, which is odd in this case, since the enemy in this case is Absalom, his own son, and Absalom's allies are also part of the Jews. It's basically a civil war. But David appropriates to himself being symbolic of the entire Jewish people, or the author appropriates to David being a stand-in for the entire Jewish people here. So even though the enemies are also Jewish in this case, or Israelites, David is the one who's loyal to God and the other people aren't. Although again, in the text of Absalom, there's no indication that Absalom is an idolater or anything like that. It's all about power. But nevertheless, that's a song. So again, forgetting the history at an emotional level, I find this very powerful. Any comments or questions about this song before we move on to the next?
Well, if no one else has a question, Sid, I'll ask a question. And it's also really a question for Ronnie as well. I'm very kind of intrigued by that theme about God just loves us because he loves us. Like, we don't have to be good. Like, I would have thought usually we kind of get the message, God will love us if we're good. So I wonder if you or Ronnie or both have a comment on kind of what's the story there about why God chooses to love some people.
Then you take it away.
Well, maybe Ronnie thought about it more with her or Torah. If you want to comment quickly, Ronnie.
That's sort of what I took from Harold Bloom when I read it years ago is that exactly as Marianne says, there's no real, it's like love is kind of, sort of comes from this emotional core. And so there's not a lot of, calculation, you do good, then it's not this conditional thing. It's just pure love. And it's kind of unconditional, which is what's really so amazing about it. So I'm drawn to you. I love you. You make me love you, right? And it's just this kind of a fusion of emotion. That's what I took from it. It's completely the opposite of binary of good and evil. If you're bad, you get punished. If you're good, you get rewarded. It's really got nothing to do with that, as far as I can tell. But that's a very incomplete answer.
Okay, I would say that in the Psalms you have both of those. Both the previous Psalm says the good get rewarded and the bad get punished. Here, although it doesn't really talk about good and evil, it's just about save me from my enemies. But again, if you know historically, the enemies are also Israelites, and there's no implication that David is particularly good. He just loves God. So that's his thing, is that he loves God back very much, maybe more than other people. I would say that it's maybe, well, I don't know. I don't want to go too far into it because I really don't know the answer. But it's sort of like a parent's concern for a child. If you're good, you get punished. If you're bad, you get rewarded. But the parent is always concerned. The parent is always watching. The parent is always involved. And that's maybe that sort of thing.
Both are true, right?
Yeah, David Wiegans has his hand up too. So
okay,
I think he can go.
Realizing that I don't want to inject a modern psychological overlay onto something written a very long time ago, I still wonder whether the writers were writing about what they thought was, like God loves us and will pull us through, or it was wishing that it be so. Was this is, or was this ought to be? And what was in the minds of both the composers and the listeners to hearing this, especially in times where there was political turmoil and migrations and threats from around and short periods of stability that weren't really there. Was it yearning or was it belief?
So I think this particular poem, he's sure that God is going to do this for him. But the power for us readers, and by us I mean 2,000 years of readers, is belief. It's desire. We read this poem because we want to believe it's true. We need help, and we want to have, you want to be optimistic that God is going to save you. So yes, when we read it, we're pleading, but we're using the certainty of this case and the proof text that David did survive to give us hope that God will save us just like he saved David. So I think it's different in the voice of the first person narrator and different in the reader. The reader is hoping and wishing because we're not certain. And I'm sure Jews thousands of years ago weren't certain either. But David is certain, and that's why we like to read it. That's why it's powerful. Okay, I'm going to go on.
Sid, I've just been told Howell wanted to make a comment, but he can't raise his hand. So maybe Howell, you could unmute and talk.
And then we'll go on to the next one because I want to get through the other one. Howell, please.
Oh, yeah, I'll be very brief. Just in terms of the Sela, I remember Jay Broadbar had a teaching where he translated it as right on. And I just find when I'm reading it, it really works.
Yes, I mean, I think it's like that's what it means. I mean, it's emphasis or something, but it was, but scholars say it's a musical notation. It's almost not part of the poem, which is why they've typeset it off to the side here, because it's really not meant to be read, even though I read it. It was sort of like a musical notation to the singers or the musicians or something. So,
Thanks.
okay. So I'm going to go on to the next one.
Can I just say something? I don't know how to raise my hand.
Okay, sure.
With regards to the Shir HaMa'alot of the songs, in sound healing, there's an understanding that that's the idea of going up a tone, but we're not talking the major and the minor tones. We're talking the energetic tones of the body. So there is an understanding, a study which looks at the Psalms as healing prayers, and whatever the music was, worked with the different centers, energy centers in the body.
Not that I'm aware of, and what I did read is that no one really knows what the music was.
Correct.
Some people claim it's sort of like similar to Gregorian chants today. I didn't find that very moving, but I'm not a scholar. But mostly people say we really don't know, the music is lost.
Right, right. It's a theory. It's a theory. But there has been some study done on healing tones and assigning them to different psalms.
Okay, so Psalm 23, this is perhaps one of the most famous Psalms of all. A David Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. In grass meadows he makes me lie down, by quiet waters guides me. My life he brings back, he leads me on pathways of justice for his name's sake. Though I walk in the vale of death's shadow, I fear no harm, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, it is they that console me. You set out a table before me. In the face of my foes, you moisten my head with oil. My cup overflows. But let goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for many long days. Okay, so this is obviously Psalm 23. We're probably more familiar with the King James translation. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down, and et cetera, et cetera. But this is a maybe less familiar, but maybe breaking the familiarity is good. Make us think a little bit more about what the words are. So again, a David Psalm, presumably written by David or about him in his voice. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. So we have the image of God as a shepherd, a very common image in prophetic works. We are his sheep, God is our shepherd. Sheep are pretty stupid and passive, they can't take care of themselves. Without a shepherd, they'll get eaten by wolves and wild animals, so God protects us. We shall not want. In grassy meadows, he makes me lie down. Well, sheep eat grass, so the image is simple. I mean, we can think of ourselves lying in a park, which is, I think, what many of us do think when we think about this, or if it's at a funeral, being buried in a grassy cemetery. But the original image is simply that sheep eat grass, and a good shepherd takes them to grassy meadows. And by quiet waters, he guides me. Sheep need to drink. They need a source of water. They take them to a river or a spring or something. My life he brings back. He leads me on the pathways of justice for his name's sake. So this is an interesting word or verse here. My life he brings back. Again, I think the King James is my soul he restores. Even my life he brings back is a little bit misleading, I think, because the word here is nephesh. Now, nephesh in later Hebrew means soul. Nowadays it means soul. But in biblical Hebrew, it meant breath. It's from the same root as to breathe. So he brings back my breath. If I'm tired, he restores my breath. By transferring it to life or soul, again, this is another reason it's sort of the translation in King James is one of the reasons it's used at funerals, because he brings back my life. And of course, Christians believe well, not just Christians, Jews also believe, traditional Jews also believe in resurrection. So it's a hint in that way of resurrection, but I think in the original, just he brings back my breath when I'm tired. He leads me on the pathways of justice for his name's sake. So again, this is interesting here. We don't have, he just feeds me, he gives me food and protection. The pathways of justice are interesting, that here we have sort of morality coming back into this idea of goodness, of reward. And not for my own sake, but for his sake. So again, I have no good deeds to claim this. It's God doing it out of his grace, so to speak. Though I walk in the veil of death's shadow, I fear no harm, you are with me. This is also an interesting issue of translation. The word in Hebrew is tsalmavet, which appears nowhere else in the Bible. And as Alter points out, it's probably a mispronunciation, a misvocalization, because there are no vowels in written Hebrew, of Salmut. And Salmut just means darkness. So it probably meant, though I walk in the dark valley, I fear no harm. But because of, again, a mistranslation, because Tsalmavet word mavet means death. So Tsalmavet is a portmanteau of two words, sail and mavet, stuck together. Sail means shadow, mavet means death. It doesn't appear anywhere else, but Salmut does appear in other places, and it simply means darkness. So because of sort of this misvocalization or mistranslation, we get the idea of the valley of shadow of death, which is another reason it's read at funerals. Anyways, I fear no harm, you are with me. Either way, the thought is the same. I'm walking in a dark valley, I'm walking in the shadow of death. I mean, it doesn't change it from the original poem's power, but the reason of why it gets picked up at funerals is interesting. I fear no harm, you are with me. Your rod and your staff, it is they that console me. You set out a tale before me in the face of my foes. Again, the idea of being persecuted, I'm being persecuted, but I can relax. I don't have to worry. Who has time to eat a banquet in the middle of being persecuted? Well, I do, because God is with me. You moisten my head with oil, my cup overfloweth. But let goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for many long days. Again, interesting that Alter chooses to translate the last word as for many long days. The King James says forever. So again, the King James making it explicitly about resurrection. After I die, I will live with God forever. Whereas in the original, it just means I'm going to live a long life. I think Alter is quite correct. The Hebrew doesn't really mean forever. It really says for many long days, orach yamim, or I'll have a long life. That's what it originally meant. Again, sort of the theme is God takes care of me, even though I have enemies, even though I walk in dark valleys sometimes, I'm depressed or scared. I fear no harm, for you are with me. That's a central theme, whether it is or isn't about death and resurrection. I don't think it was about resurrection. David, if it is David, he lived pre the idea of resurrection. That idea didn't come into Judaism till later. Okay, let's look at one more. Again, are there any questions about this one?
I have one question. It's Leanne.
Yeah.
I noticed that in the beginning, the first 3 verses, it's talking about God, and then it switches to you, talking to God.
That's a good point, which I hadn't worked myself. Yes, that's true. I don't know what to make of it. Anybody have any thought?
There are 2 hands up. I don't know if they're in relation to this, but Gloria and Henny both have their hands up.
Hi, it's Henny. Not a question, but what struck me here is the whole first part of the poem is meditation and being in nature, the quiet and the calmness, and then coming back and belief and trust and acceptance. And it really, really struck me because we talk about now meditation so much and what it does for us. And here I see it centuries, decades, millennia ago.
Very true. I mean, the pastoral images at the beginning just relax you. I mean, just if you think about it,
Exactly.
they just
Right.
immediately relax you. And then the middle stanza is, just about God will be with you. He feeds me. He will feed, maybe it's not happening at this moment, but he will feed me. He will give me rest. He will give me.
It's a yes, you're at peace and you're trusting and accepting, and it just flows.
Yeah, absolutely true.
Okay, I just had a comment about the Valley of Death. I'm reading the Jewish Study Bible, and it says, "Though I walk through a valley of deepest darkness."
That is probably a better translation.
And Shirley also has her hand up.
Just wanted to mention the word Betzalel, the name. Here we have death's shadow, and then we have God's shadow, which is positive in the name Betzalel. And a second one, you moisten my head, I would say is not just moistening. Dishanta in Hebrew means like you're fertilizing my head with oil. The oil is actually abundant, and I think the translation of you moisten my head with oil is unfortunate. That's all I wanted to say.
Let's go see what the King James says instead of moistening. Here's the King James.
Anoint, I think. It's anoint, right?
Yes, it's anoint, again, because King James wants to allude to David being anointed and Jesus being in the line of David, and they have a theological point in saying anointed, which of course is how kings were anointed. They poured oil on their head, but at least in biblical times. But just, you should know, I mean, in biblical times, putting oil on your head was a sort of like going to the spa. They didn't have shampoo, so you put oil on your head, you rubbed it in, it got a massage, and then you could comb out your hair, because it made it, if your hair was all tangled, the oil let you comb out your hair and get rid of the gunk and stuff. So it was just sort of a luxurious sort of spa treatment, literally. But anyways, okay, let's go on to the next one. Psalm 29. So.
Sorry, Sid. I just wanted to say that, like what Ronnie was talking about, Devar, and you're talking about love. It seemed to me that the word means bonding, and in the song we just went through, like that bond of, like Gloria was saying, first it's you, God, and then first it's God talking to us, and then there's a direct connection. It seems to me that all of this is a reiteration of a very deep bond of oneness, togetherness. I'm for you, you're for me, we are. Does that make any sense?
I don't know. I mean, it's a poem, so it depends how people read it. I don't. God is in charge here. It's not. This isn't pantheism, but it's a poem. Debbie, I think you have your hand up. You want to say anything? You're muted, Debbie.
Sorry, I couldn't get the raise hand function. It was being wonky. I just wanted to actually go back to Leanne's, just quickly to go back to Leanne's comment about why do we switch from this God as third person, as he, as opposed to you. And I think for me, if we're talking about something that is so much beyond ourselves, it makes us feel very small and very vulnerable. And to have this sense of, I can say you, because if I say you, it means that I'm actually an important part of this relationship. It's not just about, I worship this thing, but that actually I am part of a relationship. And when I feel that I am valued in a relationship, then I can perhaps use you, and as opposed to he, and never forget the gender, challenges with language. I think it's just we have more connection in the relationship when we can make it I and you, or as people would say, I and thou, but you start getting into this closer relationship.
I think that's a very good point, and it's about many of the Psalms. God is very personal in the Psalms. God is a character. He's not something remote at all in the Psalms. I mean, maybe in some one or two of them, but mostly he's a character, and so the personal part is very important in Psalms in general. I said the two themes that are consistent is God is powerful and God is personal. Okay, so we'll go on to Psalm 29, which is the last one for today. A David psalm. Grant to the Lord, O sons of God, grant to the Lord glory and strength. Grant to the Lord his name's glory. Bow to the Lord his holy majesty. The Lord's voice is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord is over mighty waters. The Lord's voice is power. The Lord's voice is in majesty. The Lord's voice breaking cedars. The Lord shatters the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon dance like a calf, Sirion like a young wild ox. The Lord's voice hews flames of fire. The Lord's voice makes wilderness shake. The Lord makes Kadesh wilderness shake. The Lord's voice brings on the birth pangs of does and lays bare the forests, and his palace all says glory. The Lord was enthroned at the flood. The Lord is enthroned as king for all time. May the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace. So first of all, does anyone recognize this? I can show you the Hebrew, and I think you would recognize it, but does anyone recognize it? Okay, I'll show you the Hebrew. Mizmor LaDavid, Havu LaDonai b'nei Elim, Havu LaDonai kavod va'oz, Havu LaDonai kavod shemo, Ishtachavu LaDonai b'hadrat kodesh, Kol Adonai el hamayim, etc., etc. So we sing this at the recessional, I believe, when we put back the Torah at the end. But back to the text itself. First of all, again, literary scholars say this is one of the oldest psalms, and that stylistically, it looks very much like the Psalm of Deborah in the book of Judges, and both of them date, according to this school of thought, to maybe 1000 or 1100 BC. So it's a very old psalm one way or the other. And if you look at the themes of the psalm, they're very theologically primitive. So first of all, grant to the Lord sons of God. What are sons of God? I mean, this hints to some of the ideas in the early chapters of Genesis, that there are these sons of God who came down and married the daughters of man, and the Nephilim, these giants came out of them. And this is very, polytheistic Greek myth, or maybe Canaanite myth or something here. So, I mean, it's a hint of it. It's just, it could be, you could just say sons of man is just people, but there's a hint here. The sons of God are just people, but there's a hint here of something much older. One of the theories is that this echoes a Canaanite prayer, a Canaanite song, I guess, to Baal, and they've just switched around, stuck in Yahweh instead of Baal or whoever was there before. Again, some scholars disagree, but it's sort of an interesting theory. We hear the Lord's voice is over the water, the Lord's voice is in power, the Lord's voice breaks the cedar. It's about the Lord's voice. The Lord's voice repeats itself over and over again. Baal is the thunder god. So Baal has a very loud voice. So it would make a lot of sense for Baal's voice to be able to do all these things. Part of the theory of why this was basically subverting a Canaanite, if not actually subverting a Canaanite poem, and just simply replacing Yahweh with Baal with Yahweh, playing on themes of the Canaanites in order to show that our God is better than your God. Also, the idea of the Lord's voice is over the waters, and the theme, it repeats itself. The Lord is established over mighty waters. The Canaanite creation myth is that everything, the earth was covered with water, and Baal beats back the sea serpent, something like Leviathan, and the god Yam, who's the god of the sea, and he creates dry land out of the water. So again, that the Lord is over the waters. So he's both, so Baal is sort of the land, Baal is his domain is only the land. There's another god, Yam, who controls the sea in Canaanite mythology. But God, our God, is over the waters as well as land. Of course, the idea of breaking the cedars of Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon were famously strong and famously important. If you wanted to build a big building, you needed strong wood. You didn't need it for the walls, but you build the walls out of stone. But if you wanted to build building, you needed the roof beams to be made of cedar, and they needed to be, if it was going to be more than a small building, you needed very strong, big logs to put up there, and those grew in Lebanon. So they were famous in the land of Israel. They didn't grow locally. You had to go to Lebanon to get these big cedar beams. And of course, the book of Kings tells us that when Solomon built the temple, he had an agreement with the king of Tyre, I believe, and he traded with him for cedar beams to build the roof of the first Beit HaMikdash, the temple. So anyways, breaking a cedar is like breaking an oak in our sort of idea. Very strong, big tree. He makes Lebanon dance like a calf and Sirion like a wild ox. So Lebanon and Sirion, now Lebanon is a country, but it referred to mountain ranges. There's the Lebanon mountain range and the Sirion mountain range, from which the word Syria comes from today. So Lebanon is the first range of mountains. Then there's the Bekaa Valley, and the next range of mountains are called the Sirion Mountains. So these are two mountain ranges that he makes dance, maybe an allusion to earthquakes, but are just being strong that he can make mountains dance. He hews flames of fire. He makes the wilderness shake. He makes the wilderness Kadesh shake, the desert. So again, it almost sounds like an earthquake, but who knows if that's what it's an allusion to. But certainly there were earthquakes in ancient times, so God causes earthquakes, or maybe that's what it means. His loud voice brings on the birth pang of does. It lays the forest bare. His palace also has glory. The Lord is enthroned at the flood, so he's long lived. He goes all the way back to the flood, and again the idea of the Canaanite myth that Baal is what took them out of the flood. The Lord is enthroned as king for all time. That, given that it's a parallelism, it probably means that the Lord was enthroned at the flood, that the Lord is enthroned as the king for all time. Harkening back to the flood probably just means a long time. He's been God for a long time. And it ends with, may the Lord give strength to his people, and may the Lord bless his people with peace, which I think is a lovely thought. You need both strength and peace. Strength will bring peace, or you can't trust peace, so you need strength, but it's a lovely thought. You need both, perhaps. Not a lovely thought, but an interesting thought. Anything else I wanted to say here? No, I think that's it. Again, it's a very primitive poem, and sort of singing it when we put away the Torah scroll, to me, it's like we're singing about God's strength, his pure natural power and really awesome strength. And somehow we're saying that as we carry the Torah scroll around the synagogue is an interesting message at that point in the service. So, any questions or comments?
I said it's Howell. I just looked at it in our siddur. The opening is "Give to the one who is, you so-called gods," which is interesting translation.
Okay, let's look at the Hebrew. It's Mizmor David, Havlo Donai B'nai Elim, Havlo Donai Kavod Oz. Yeah, I don't know where so-called comes from. B'nai Elim is pretty sons of the gods, plural.
Yeah, be interesting to see what Art Scroll, how they would translate it too.
Yeah. Okay, so we looked at 4 Psalms. Oh, Gloria?
Okay, so the translation here is ascribe to the Lord, O divine beings, which probably is not as good a translation as sons of gods.
Yes, and both those translations try to get over the problematic theology of sons of gods. What does that mean? I mean, you have to understand it as being a metaphor, or else it flies in the face of, official Jewish theology. But official Jewish theology wasn't official until much after these poems were written. So, especially if this one is from like literally from 1000 BC or something. So
yeah, so at that time, the Israelites regarded God as just a more powerful God amongst all the others.
Many, yes, and this sort of alludes to that.
Okay.
Okay, then. So I just will wrap it up. So we looked at 4.
Sid, can I ask a question about pronouns? Leanne and Debbie got me thinking about what were the original pronouns here? I mean, I think the question about you and thou is interesting because thou was used as a more familiar pronoun, and the King James Version was translated as thou, not you. And then, of course, all the third person pronouns are masculine, but I'm wondering if it's that way in the original, or is that something that the translators imposed on it?
Okay, so let me go back to this poem, which is Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. Well, so the you there in the 4th verse, because you have stood by me, is ata, which is the second person singular. So in ancient English, it's, today it's you, but
would have been thou, which was it also used as more familiar, like the way it was when we had thou and you?
No, because you wouldn't refer to a king as atem in the plural. So it was just singular. There was singular and plural, and it wasn't as if you used the plural for someone important. You didn't. You still used.
I see. Okay.
But it's just the second person singular, but it is in the masculine. So yeah, God is all the pronouns have God as masculine. So for better or worse, that's the way it is.
Sid?
Well, that's the way it was, yes.
Sid?
Yes?
Oh, yeah, I just want this is sort of off topic. I just want to off topic, on topic. But several of these verses have been set to music and consequently to Israeli dance, and are very popular in the Israeli dance repertoire, in particularly Miha Ish. It's a beautiful, beautiful music and a beautiful dance.
Yes.
Just kind of by the way.
Yes. And many of them are set to, obviously in the Christian tradition, half the service is singing psalms. They have a book called the Psalter, and, they sing psalms. And many of them are been put into operas and symphonies, and yes, they were originally musical and they've remained musical throughout history, although different music, obviously. Okay, so I just wanted to cover the themes again. We had the opening one, which I think is interesting that it was placed at the beginning. It's very universalistic, and the theme is, if you're good, you'll get rewarded. If you're bad, you'll be punished. But it's very universalistic. It doesn't mention Jews or King David or anything. And then the second one was extremely particular. It's about David when he's running away from Absalom. I'm persecuted, woe is me, everybody hates me, I'm about to get killed. God, please save me. I know you'll save me. You've always saved me in the past. Save me. And by the way, God blesses his people Israel because I'm just like Israel. And then the third one is Lord is my shepherd. Again, this sort of confidence, but a much more quiet confidence in God's support. God will take care of me. He will feed me. He will give me rest. Maybe I'm afraid of death, or maybe I'm just in a dark valley, which could be depression or could be just a tough place in life. But God will pull me out. But it's the same theme as the second one, but in a much more quiet, less violent tone. God, I have tough times, but God will be with me and things will all work out. And then the last one we talked about is God as sort of creator of the universe, and God is all powerful and mastering nature, and his voice just breaks trees. That's how strong he is. So okay, so we'll do this again in a month or so when we get it scheduled, and I hope you enjoyed it, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Sid. And Shabbat Shalom to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Sid.
you.
That was
Shabbat
great.
shalom.
Shabbat
Very much,
shalom.
Sid.
That was great.
very
Thank
much.
you.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sid. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat Shalom.
Hello.
Shabbat
Shabbat
Shalom to
Shalom.
everyone. Yishar Koach.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sid.
Thank you.